Claire Thompson, a 48-year-old marketing executive with a penchant for control, strode onto the red-eye flight from Chicago to Los Angeles with the confidence of someone who always got her way. Her tailored blazer and clicking Louboutin heels announced her presence as she navigated the narrow aisle, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. The first-class cabin, her usual sanctuary, promised a few hours of peace before a high-stakes client meeting. But when she reached her assigned seat, 2A, her expression soured. Dr. Marcus Ellis, a 32-year-old black cardiologist, sat by the window, his neat blazer unbuttoned as he reviewed patient charts on his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. Claire's lips pursed into a thin line. She stood frozen, her hand tightening on her bag's handle, as if the sight of Marcus offended her carefully curated world. Without making eye contact, she waved over a flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, and hissed, "I need a different seat." Sarah, caught off guard, glanced at Marcus, who hadn't looked up, and asked, "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Claire's voice was low but sharp, dripping with entitlement. "I'm not comfortable here. Surely you have something else." Sarah explained the flight was fully booked, but Claire's face reddened, her posture rigid. "This is unacceptable," she snapped, loud enough for nearby passengers to glance over. Marcus, overhearing, paused his work, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. But he said nothing. His years of navigating such moments, teaching him silence, was often the better choice. Sarah, flustered, promised to check for options, leaving Claire standing awkwardly in the aisle, her indignation a palpable force. A businessman in 1C adjusted his glasses, watching the scene unfold, while a silver-haired woman across the aisle muttered, "Unbelievable." Under her breath, Claire ignored them, her mind racing with justifications. She wasn't prejudiced, she told herself. She just wanted her space, her comfort, her way. But the weight of her words hung in the air, and as boarding continued, she felt the first prick of unease, though she'd never admit it. The cabin buzzed with a low hum of pre-flight activity as Claire stood her ground, her arms crossed, refusing to sit next to Marcus. Sarah, the flight attendant, returned after a brief consultation with her supervisor, her face a mask of forced politeness. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there are no other seats available in first class, and economy is nearly full," she said, her voice strained. Claire's eyes narrowed, her voice rising just enough to draw more stares. "I paid for a premium experience, not to be stuck in an uncomfortable situation. Do your job and fix this." The word uncomfortable landed like a stone, its implication clear to everyone within earshot. Marcus, who had been pretending to focus on his tablet, finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Claire's for a fleeting moment. His gaze was steady, almost kind, but carried a quiet strength that made her flinch. "If it's easier, I can move to economy," he offered, his tone calm and professional, as if he'd made this offer before. Claire scoffed, turning her head away, dismissing him as if he were invisible. The silver-haired woman across the aisle, whose name tag read Eleanor, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Some people need to check their egos before boarding." Claire shot her a glare but said nothing, her cheeks flushing. Sarah, desperate to defuse the situation, promised to double-check with the gate agent, leaving Claire standing like a statue, her designer coat brushing against a passing passenger's elbow. Marcus resumed his work, though his fingers hovered over the tablet, betraying a flicker of frustration. He'd faced this before, veiled slights, assumptions, outright rejection, but it never got easier. The businessman in 1C whispered something to his seatmate, and a young woman in a hoodie a few rows back shook her head in disgust. Claire, sensing the cabin's judgment, doubled down on her resolve, convincing herself she was in the right. But as the minutes ticked by, Her stance felt less like victory and more like a trap of her own making, the weight of her prejudice pressing against her chest, like a stone she couldn't dislodge. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah returned with a solution. A passenger in economy, a college student traveling on a budget, had agreed to swap seats. Claire's lips curled into a triumphant smirk as she gathered her belongings, not sparing Marcus a glance as she followed Sarah to the back of the plane. Her new seat, 32B, was a middle seat in the heart of economy, wedged between a burly truck driver who was already dozing, his snores rattling like a chainsaw, and a teenager with neon green earbuds leaking tinny hip-hop. Claire's smugness evaporated as she squeezed into the cramped space, her designer coat catching on a sticky armrest. The air smelled faintly of stale pretzels, and the seatbelt felt uncomfortably tight. She glanced toward first class, where Marcus now sat alone, his row spacious and serene. Moments later, the college student who'd taken Claire's seat struck up a conversation with Marcus, recognizing him from a guest lecture at her university. "Dr. Ellis, right? Your talk on heart disease prevention was amazing," she said, her eyes bright. Marcus smiled, warming to the discussion, and soon they were deep in conversation about medical school and patient care. Claire, catching snippets of their voices over the drone of the engines, felt a pang she couldn't name. She told herself she'd won. She'd gotten what she wanted, hadn't she? But the truck driver's elbow jostled her, and the teenager's music grew louder, and the reality of her choice settled in like a bad meal. She shifted uncomfortably, her mind replaying the scene in first class, her words, her actions. The plane climbed into the night sky, and Claire, for the first time, felt the sting of isolation, not from her seat, but from the wall she'd built around herself. She tried to focus on her presentation notes, but the words blurred, her thoughts circling back to Marcus's calm offer to move, his dignity in the face of her disdain. An hour into the flight, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, the cabin lurching as if slapped by an invisible hand. Claire's stomach dropped, her fingers digging into the armrests as the overhead bins rattled. The teenager beside her let out a nervous laugh, muttering, "Whoa, roller coaster vibes," while the truck driver slept on oblivious, his head lolling against her shoulder. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. "Folks, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Claire's heart pounded. She'd always hated flying, the loss of control, the fragility of it all. In economy, the seats felt claustrophobic, the air stale, amplifying her anxiety. She glanced toward first class, where the wider seats and extra legroom seemed a world away. Up front, Marcus and the college student, whose name was Maya, barely noticed the turbulence, engrossed in a discussion about the ethics of experimental treatments. Marcus's voice was steady, his hands gesturing as he explained a case study, and Maya nodded eagerly, scribbling notes on her phone. Claire, straining to hear them over the plane's groans, felt a flicker of something, envy, perhaps, or regret. She tried to focus on her breathing, counting to 10 as her therapist had taught her, but the turbulence worsened, the plane dipping sharply. A child a few rows back whimpered, and Claire's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She told herself she was fine, that she'd made the right choice, that sitting next to him would have been worse. But the lie felt hollow, and as the plane shuddered again, she couldn't shake the image of Marcus's calm demeanor, his quiet strength. The turbulence eased, but Claire's unease didn't. Her thoughts tangled in a web of fear, pride, and something she wasn't ready to name. Just as the cabin settled, a piercing cry shattered the fragile calm. A man in his 60s, seated in row 28, clutched his chest, his face contorted in pain as he gasped for air. His wife, frantic, screamed, "Help! Someone help him!" The cabin erupted in murmurs, passengers craning their necks as two flight attendants rushed to the scene, their faces pale. Sarah's voice crackled over the intercom, urgent. "Is there a doctor on board? Please identify yourself immediately." Claire, frozen in her seat, watched as Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and moved swiftly down the aisle, his expression focused, his movements precise. He knelt beside the man, whose name was Harold, and checked his pulse, his voice calm but commanding. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm a doctor. Tell me where it hurts." Harold's wife, sobbing, clutched Marcus's arm, babbling about her husband's heart condition. Marcus nodded, his hand steady as he loosened Harold's collar and asked Sarah for the onboard medical kit and defibrillator. Claire's mouth went dry, her earlier disdain for Marcus now a distant echo. Passengers whispered, some praying, as Marcus worked, his training taking over. "Possible myocardial infarction," he said, directing Sarah to prepare the defibrillator. The teenager beside Claire muttered, "Damn, that guy's a hero." And even the truck driver, now awake, leaned forward, watching intently. Claire's heart raced, not from turbulence, but from the weight of her actions. She'd refused to sit next to this man, dismissed him without a thought, and now he was saving a life. The plane's engines hummed, but the cabin felt silent, all eyes on Marcus as he administered CPR, his rhythm steady, his focus unbreakable. Claire's hands trembled in her lap, her mind screaming what her voice couldn't. She'd been wrong, terribly wrong. Marcus's hands moved with practiced precision, delivering chest compressions as the defibrillator charged. "Clear," he said, his voice steady, and the machine delivered a shock to Harold's chest. The man's wife, Ellen, sobbed, her hands clasped in prayer, while passengers held their breath. After a tense moment, Harold's eyes fluttered, his breathing shallow but present. Marcus checked his pulse again, nodding to Sarah. "He's stabilizing, but he needs a hospital now." The captain announced an emergency landing in Denver, and the plane began its descent. Marcus stayed with Harold, monitoring his vitals, briefing the flight attendants with calm authority. When paramedics boarded in Denver, Marcus gave them a concise report, his professionalism undeniable. As he returned to his seat, passengers erupted in applause, some reaching out to shake his hand. Maya, the college student, beamed, saying, "You're incredible, Dr. Ellis." Eleanor, the silver-haired woman, caught Claire's eye from across the plane and said pointedly, "That's what a real hero looks like." Claire's face burned, her throat tight with shame. She sat motionless in 32B. The truck driver's snores resuming, the teenager now scrolling on his phone. The weight of her prejudice crashed over her like a wave. She judged Marcus without knowing him, dismissed him for reasons she couldn't defend. The applause from Marcus felt like a rebuke, each clap a reminder of her folly. She wanted to disappear, to rewind the night, to undo the scene she'd caused. But there was no escape, only the truth staring her in the face. Her actions had consequences, and karma had delivered its verdict in the form of a man's life, saved by the very person she'd rejected. As the plane took off again, Claire stared at the seat back in front of her, her victory in getting a new seat now a hollow, bitter loss. The flight to Los Angeles resumed, cabin quieter now, the earlier drama settling into a hushed reverence. Claire sat in 32B, her hands folded in her lap, her mind a storm of regret and reckoning. She thought of her corner office, her meticulously planned life, her reputation as a woman who never backed down. None of it shielded her from the shame that now consumed her. In first class, Marcus and Maya resumed their conversation, their voices low but animated, discussing the future of medicine. Marcus, unaware of Claire's turmoil, carried himself with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all night. Claire wanted to apologize, to cross the cabin and say something, anything, to make amends, but her pride, though cracked, held her back. The plane landed smoothly, and passengers began to disembark. Claire lingered, watching Marcus exit with Maya, who was still thanking him for his advice. In the terminal, Claire overheard Maya tell a friend, "That doctor saved a life tonight. I want to be like him someday." The words cut deep, a final twist of the knife. Claire walked to baggage claim alone, her heels clicking on the polished floor, each step heavier than the last. She thought of the biases she'd let fester, the assumptions she'd cloaked in excuses. For the first time, she saw them clearly, not as quirks, but as flaws that had hurt others, and now herself. She didn't know where to begin, but as she stepped into the Los Angeles night, she vowed to try. Change wouldn't come easily, not for someone as stubborn as Claire, but the memory of Marcus's actions, his grace under fire, would be her guide. She hailed a taxi, her reflection faint in the window, and promised herself she'd confront the parts of her she'd been too proud to face, knowing it was a journey she couldn't avoid. Claire stood at the baggage claim in Los Angeles, her eyes fixed on the conveyor belt, though her mind was elsewhere, replaying the flight's events like a relentless loop. The tear in her coat, the applause from Marcus, Maya's admiring words, they all stung, each a karmic lash for her prejudice. As she reached for her suitcase, a familiar voice broke her trance. "Excuse me, ma'am, is this yours?" It was Marcus, holding a small scarf that had slipped from her bag, his expression neutral but kind. Claire's heart lurched, her mouth opening, then closing, as shame choked her words. She nodded, taking the scarf, her fingers brushing his briefly, a fleeting connection that felt like a rebuke. "Thank you," she mumbled, barely audible, her face hot. Marcus nodded and turned to leave, but not before Maya, trailing behind, said, "Dr. Ellis, you're presenting at the conference tomorrow, right? I'm bringing my study group." His smile was warm, professional, as he confirmed, unaware of Claire's turmoil. The crowd parted, and Claire watched him go, his dignity a stark contrast to her unraveling composure. A nearby passenger, who'd witnessed the flight's drama, muttered to a friend, "That's the doctor who saved that guy. Class act." Claire's stomach twisted, the scarf in her hand a tangible reminder of her misjudgment. She'd wanted to apologize, to bridge the gap her actions had created, but her pride, though battered, held her tongue. The baggage claim spun on, and Claire felt stranded, not by the airport's chaos, but by the weight of her own flaws. Karma wasn't done. She could feel it in the eyes of strangers, in the scarf's soft fabric, in Marcus's effortless grace. She clutched her suitcase and headed for the exit, her resolve to change flickering. But the path forward felt daunting, a solitary climb she wasn't sure she could make. The next morning, Claire sat in the sleek conference center, her notes for her marketing pitch neatly arranged, but her focus frayed. She'd barely slept, haunted by Marcus's face, the scarf, the flight. Her client meeting was in an hour, but fate or karma had other plans. The conference's keynote was a medical panel, and Marcus was a speaker. His name glowed on the program. Dr. Marcus Ellis, cardiologist, and Claire's pulse quickened as he took the stage, his presence commanding yet humble. He spoke on health disparities, his voice steady, weaving data with stories of patients he'd saved, including a veiled reference to a recent flight emergency. The audience, including Maya and her study group, hung on his words, their applause thunderous. Claire, seated near the back, felt exposed, as if every word indicted her. A woman beside her whispered, "He's brilliant. Imagine having him as your doctor." Claire nodded weakly, her throat tight. She remembered her demand to change seats, her dismissal of Marcus, and now here he was, celebrated, while she sat diminished, her success hollow. The panel ended, and attendees swarmed Marcus, thanking him, seeking advice. Claire wanted to approach, to confess her regret, but the crowd felt like a wall, her shame a barrier. Karma's latest lesson was clear. Her prejudice had not only isolated her on the plane, but diminished her here, in a world where Marcus shone. She gathered her notes, her hands trembling, and slipped out, the applause echoing behind her. The client meeting loomed, but Claire knew her polished exterior masked a deeper failure, one she could no longer ignore. She vowed to confront her biases, not just for Marcus, but for herself, though the weight of that promise felt heavier than ever. Back at her hotel, Claire sat on the edge of her bed, the city's lights sprawling beyond her window, a glittering contrast to her inner turmoil. The scarf Marcus had returned lay on the dresser, a quiet accusation. Her client meeting had gone well. Her pitch was flawless, her charm intact, but the victory felt empty, overshadowed by the conference, Marcus's speech, and the relentless drum of her conscience. She opened her laptop, searching his name, and found articles praising his work, a TED Talk on equity in healthcare, testimonials from patients whose lives he'd saved. Each click deepened her regret, a karmic mirror reflecting her smallness. She thought of her life, successful, yes, but built on a foundation of unexamined biases, snap judgments, and a need to control. Marcus's actions on the flight, his grace at the conference, had exposed those flaws, and karma had ensured she felt their weight. Claire took a pen and began to write, not a presentation, but a letter, to herself, listing the moments she'd failed, starting with the flight. It wasn't an apology to Marcus. She wasn't ready for that, and he didn't need it. It was a reckoning, a commitment to dismantle the prejudices she'd let fester. She wrote until dawn, her hand cramping, the scarf in her lap. The path to change was daunting, but Marcus's example, his strength, his humanity, lit the way. Claire closed her laptop, exhausted but resolute, knowing this was just the beginning. Karma had struck, not to destroy her, but to demand better, and for the first time, she was ready to listen, to learn, to grow, even if it meant facing the parts of herself she'd long ignored.